Welcome to the Gem Club podcast. I'm your host, Adam Lehman. On today's episode, Ross Theisen joins D'Angelo and myself. Ross is a Columbus-based creative director, filmmaker, writer, podcaster, all in all, a doer of many things. In Ross's own words, Ross would say maybe he's doing too many things. But while using many different creative lanes and tools to produce ideas for himself and others, it's all around a love of storytelling, brand building, finding purpose, and helping people see their potential through to the end. So I wanted to have Ross on a podcast because I just saw him making so many different things that we're all obviously like part of the same, focused on one particular thing. He's got a creative agency. He does some of his own passion projects. He does his own podcast that he does for fun, and it's not connected to business particularly, and just a prolific creator. I didn't know a lot of Ross's background. I learned about that. He's very self-taught, which is awesome and follows a theme of much of the folks who are part of the Gem Club. And without any further hype, let's go chat with Ross. Ross, it's great to have you. Welcome.
Yes, thank you guys. It's Adam. It's good to see you again. D'Angelo, it's nice to meet you for the very first time, even if it is virtually. I'm stoked to be here.
It's great to meet you too, Ross. Yeah, man, we're excited to have you. So we're gonna jump right into it. Ross, you're such a multifaceted person. Like your museum is like an Instagram, or your Instagram is like a museum of content. Give the listeners a bit of background about what you do, and for the context of conversation.
Yeah. So this is where the floodgates open, and this is the thing I've been trying to get better at over the years is consolidating this and explaining it in a reasonable way. So the tag that I've associated with myself most recently, to sum everything up, is creative director and filmmaker. And of course, I do things outside of the work-related things like podcasts and all that sort of stuff. But if I were to really simplify it, I just love making things. And I love storytelling. I love the element of storytelling. And that for me can be done through video, through photo, through design, through literally telling a story. So over the years, I've just carved that out in pretty much as many different paths that I can as humanly possible, which may or may not be a good or bad thing. I don't know. We'll find that out at some point. But yeah, I guess if I wanted to label it, creative director, maybe is the right way to put it.
Okay.
That seems broad enough that allow you to do whatever you want.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Let's say if we did a scroll through your Instagram and we were like, wow, if creative director sums it up, let's distill the pieces below creative director.
Yeah.
What are the ingredients?
So it's funny because I think on my Instagram, I don't share what I would classify almost as creative director work. I would say when I share any commercial work or branded work that I've made for somebody, that's kind of what I classify that as. But then I feel like my Instagram is more so filled with the podcast, more so filled with, honestly, as of late, a lot more personal passion projects, which is a whole thing that maybe we can get into at some point. That's kind of been, I feel like, my most recent story arc, maybe the newest chapter that I've opened in this entire endeavor, is making stuff for me again. Because I feel like maybe that got lost a little bit because I got so excited about creating for other people all the time. I thought that was fulfilling to me, but realized at some point with a very hard crash that it wasn't as much. So if you scroll through my Instagram right now, you're definitely going to see a lot more filmmaking projects. I've officially been able to step my feet into the filmmaking world to where I would actually feel confident enough to say, yeah, I'm a filmmaker, or yeah, I'm a director. I actually, again, a new facet of storytelling. But I would actually find the confidence enough now to say, yes, I do that. And I actually have proof to back it up. That's not B-roll in a commercial or a music video, because that's what it was for a long time.
So you have a podcast that's going on, which I've been a guest on. It's probably the most popular episode of the podcast, I'm sure.
It just crossed the threshold from millions to billions downloads. So I meant to tell you.
That sounds like an Adam episode.
So I wasn't paid for it, so I'm glad that I'm sure you got rich out of it.
Oh yeah.
I like pretend to be. It's like sometimes when you have a podcast, you're allowed to pretend to be famous. I think that's like sort of by publishing anything, you're like, I'm going to pretend as if
Everybody's
millions of
seen it.
people listen to this
It-
and then listen to me all the time and follow me around to like listen to everything that I ever have had to say or think.
If we had more time, I'd get into the psychology of lines and how you saying we have a lot of listeners is like a line and people will get in the line. You know?
Yeah.
It's like you
Yeah.
yeah,
If we just pretend like we're sold out all the time.
that's what I'm saying.
Like, yeah, there's no more room to listen to our podcast. I guess if you stand outside and you can get in line to listen to it, um, it's sold out.
That's
You
fair.
want to be
It's
here.
fake it till you make it,
You have
right?
FOMO. We just play our podcast on an MP3 file off of our computers in our recording studio, and that's the only way to listen to it. And we have just the two of us are the only listeners. So
Nobody knows
bad.
that. It just counts as plays.
it's a good business.
So Ross,
So I've been on your podcast that you have. We're gonna get in. I want to get into a little bit of your. I want to spend most of our time talking about your personal projects because that's actually why I wanted to have you on the podcast was because you are a person who has figured out how to make time and space and do these. You've been doing a podcast for a while consistently. We'll get into all that stuff. We'll do a short run through your like professional creative career.
Yeah.
Give us a quick run through of how you got into um, creative directing. Set the stage for the professional thing you make for other people.
Yeah. So I feel like I sort of have, I guess, I don't know. Everybody's story is different. So I don't know whether to call it unconventional or maybe it is conventional. Maybe it's the way that everybody is doing it. But fresh out of high school, I knew that school was no longer for me. So it wasn't one of those decisions where I was like, oh man, I need to go to college to get a marketing degree or get a business degree or to go for art or something. I had always been creative. I'd always been artsy. Um, and I knew I kind of wanted to harness that in some way, but I knew how much I didn't like school, and how much that I probably would not give the effort into college if I went, even if somebody said, hey, it'd probably be a good idea if you went, if you want to go into entrepreneurship and all this sort of stuff. Even if I heard that or when I did, I was just sort of like, I knew my effort's not going to match maybe the results that I am going to be looking for. So basically, when the choice comes up of like, hey, you're going to go to college or not, mine was not. And I just started just trying things that I wanted to do. And they didn't work miraculously. I didn't immediately make billions of dollars or anything, but I just dove into just trying to make my ideas possible. And that started with a clothing line, and that moved into like a music like promotional agency. This was like kind of right during the time where Facebook and social media was like,
What year is this?
this is
Like,
like
is this stuff happening?
2011, 2012. So I graduated high school in 2011. And then so it was like basically right after that is when I kind of dove into all this sort of stuff, and started paying a lot of attention to social media and how to use it. I'm by no means a genius. I don't have a miraculous following. I can't sit and sell you a course on my social media tips. But I always kind of just focused on the marketing and the branding things. So I dove into these, ideas at the beginning of kind of adulthood, basically, I guess, where I just knew I didn't want the conventional work life. I really did not want to do the 9 to 5 thing and the white picket fence and the normal structure of what life was supposed to be. And at the same time, I didn't want to go to college to learn how to not maybe do this thing. So I'm sort of just somewhere right in the middle, where of course I dove into the workforce. I got a job so that way it could maybe, fund some of these endeavors like the clothing line and that sort of stuff that I wanted to do. And then over the years, I ended up meeting through that clothing line. Actually, he purchased some of the stuff. I met my business partner in a lot of different things, Josh Emery. And so he actually introduced me to the world of video. So he had been doing that. I had literally nothing, no interest even. I wasn't like actively seeking it out, saying I want to be a director. Now looking back, growing up, I always loved how films were made. I would always dig into like the behind the scenes of all that sort of stuff. But it was never an interest. And again, even in a job sense, I wasn't sitting and saying, I want to be a director. I want to be a creative director. I want to build brands. It was just, as silly as it might sound, it was just naturally just stuff I liked to do. So to make a long story short, after meeting up with him, I get my hands on video and photo and all that sort of stuff. So now I have some tools to actually be creative with. That then leads to forming brands and companies with him. And then that's when I kind of got introduced into, okay, how do you make a living off of this? How do you start getting people to want to hire you to create things for you? Because now it's like, yeah, you can sit and kind of throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks and just, be creative. But then it became the part where I was like, okay, I don't want to work this 9 to 5 to balance out this passion anymore. I would really love just to go full freelance. I would really love just to be totally self-employed. And luckily, it's like I couldn't give you a step by step of how it happened. But luckily made it work to where then it became like,
Yeah.
okay, now you're going to be directing videos and for clients. So whether it's commercials, whether it's music videos, we did weddings for a little bit. Um, and for
Like, I have a camera.
yes, yes, and
What am I allowed to do?
exactly, and that's what it was for a couple of years where there wasn't really a direction, but there was a goal of just self-employment. It wasn't necessarily, again, it was never, I want to be a director. I want to be a creative
Mm.
director. I want to work for this company. There wasn't that clear step by step that I was aiming for, but I just knew I wanted to be creative and I knew I wanted to make money by doing that. So it was definitely for a few years like anything I can do, let me do it. Because it's like I can do video, photo, graphic design, all this sort of stuff. So it was just sort of like, hey, if you want to hire me for something, I want to do it. And of course, years go by and I learned to kind of narrow those things down into what I do and do not want to do. Um, but yeah, realistically, it's like whenever I look back on it, like there wasn't really a set path that I was reaching for necessarily. If it was more so like I want to be creatively fulfilled, I want I know this is silly to say, but like I've always wanted freedom in my life. So what I mean by that is like I just want the ability to wake up every day and do what I choose to do. Whether that's to make money, whether that's to create, whether that's to help somebody else, whether that's to talk in a podcast for too long. I like that idea. So that was always kind of the mystical, shiny goal, in the horizon that I
Mm.
didn't exactly know what it looked like to get there, but I certainly wanted to try everything to get there. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think I just wanted to I'm gonna go off script. I'm gonna do a couple. I want to hang out in Ross's professional world, and now I just spend most of the time in the everything else world
Go for
because I feel like they both are relevant to the people who are listening to this. Um, I'll get 3 questions into your professional career. One, how you're self-taught. You didn't go to classes or things like that.
Yeah.
If you had to go back and describe like, "Oh, this is how I learned how to do the things that I had passion about, I found like I was interested in, and I know what it's like to just I'm self-taught, D'Angelo's self-taught, where we learned via I don't even know YouTube and other things. But if you could go back and be like, "Oh, I could have actually learned a lot more faster if I had known how I learned and known like what I was trying to get actually end up doing." What would you do? This is a terrible. I'm like circling this question, but not getting to it. Describe how you have found yourself to learn things. How do you get new skills? How do you find more information? What is the learning process like for you, knowing that we have listeners who are at some part of their journey of doing their own thing, and skill development is an important thing that most people don't talk about. Like it's one thing to say, I want to become a videographer, so I'm gonna like we can go learn how to have clients, how to price things, how to run my own business, how to organize photo shoot. There's other things, but then there's the skill of the craft.
Right.
And I think it's difficult to teach other people to do that on a podcast. But talk a little bit about how you learn.
Yeah. So I will preface this entire answer with like I've recently kind of uncovered more of like who I was as a child when it comes to not just being a creative child where every kid has an imagination of some sort, right? That goes without saying. For me, I was always drawing. I would make my own comic books. I would write my own stories. I would do all this sort of stuff that now I'm like, easily relating back to now as an adult, and I'm seeing like, oh, I kind of always did this. Now I'm just doing it in a more quote unquote legit way, right? And
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
that would happen is like, to answer it in such a simple way of how I learned is, as a kid, I would mimic things. So and that's such a simple answer and probably is not that cool, but like when I was drawing, I would just like I would look at a photo from like a magazine or a book or something of the thing I wanted to draw, and I would just sit and I wouldn't trace it, but I would look at it over here and then I would draw it over here, and I just would do that about anything where it's like, oh, I want these two characters in this comic to be fighting, and I don't exactly have that image. So I'm going to take this image of this person doing this stance and that image of this person doing that stance, and then draw those both together in my new, image where they are together. Basically, like you would take two
Mhm.
things and Photoshop them together now, right? Um,
Exactly.
and so like I kind of think that like when I got into, how can I develop these creative skills now for myself as, as an adult, as an 18, 19-year-old, whatever, leaving high school and wanting to learn how to make a clothing line or make merch for bands or design album artwork for bands or logos for companies, whatever it was just sort of like I feel like I took some of those artistic skills that I had as a kid, and I would just sort of look at something that I said, I wish I could do that, or I wish I had that. And then I would literally just sit and I would just do it. I would do it and do it and do it until I had my close enough version that made me feel accomplished. So if I were sitting and I was like, oh man, that, logo for that pizza company looks really cool. I wish I could make that. I would just sit and I would dive into Photoshop and I would just figure out like, because I never even took a Photoshop class. Like I can
Mm.
design a ton of things, but there are friends of mine who have went to art school who I guarantee know every shortcut, everything on a keyboard that you can do that I have no idea how to do. But I know how to make things, and I feel like such unconventional ways. Like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, I almost know all the weird roundabout ways to get to something where there might be a simpler way to do it, but I've
Mhm.
known what works for me and like how I've learned, so it's like I might not know all of those keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop or even what half of the tools in there do, but I can still design exactly what I want to design and I still get there in my own way. So
Mm. That's all.
You relate to that?
Yeah, for sure, man.
I was like, as he's talking, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like what I've watched you do so many of these things.
Yeah, I like, sometimes I, get real innovative with, like, capturing sound from the internet, I'll, like, still rip MP3s off of YouTube,
oh yeah.
allegedly. Sometimes, I'll use, like yeah, it's a lot of stuff that I do that Adam has to remind me
Well, we
that,
do
like,
these.
we have a budget for, you know?
Well,
Like
well, yeah, there's times where D'Angelo like he like figures out how to do things in ways where I'm like, I think if you wanted to hire a person to teach us to do that amazingly, just right away, we could do that. We could like pay someone to teach us things. I remember we had a presentation as a whole team. We do this thing every
like, month?
couple months called show and tell, where
Mhm.
everybody like shows their work to other people that they might not see. It's like behind the scenes stuff. It's really cool. And I remember the first time we did this, D'Angelo had I think you made a presentation in the hardest way possible,
Mhm.
and that you recorded yourself doing the presentation as a video so that you could speak over it in your allotted time, because we don't have it's kind of like a tight window of time you have. We don't have
Mhm.
like we're not sitting around listening to 8 people talk for an hour each.
Exactly.
And you were like real focused on like hitting like talking through it. And I remember you were loading, I just was like, wow, you like have worked around a thing that is like simple in a difficult way, but it made a whole entirely different experience where you're able to share audio and you could really like dictate what was going on.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, there's just so much of that. When Ross, when you said that, when you're like, I figured out how to do things that probably are a keyboard shortcut in like a very hard and painful way, but you understand it. It's like
Yeah.
it's how you wrap your mind
Mhm.
around things.
Right.
Um, I think this will be my last question about your professional
Yep.
career. It's all connected, so you can talk about whatever you want. You mentioned having a crash and then getting into making sure you had more space for personal
Hmm.
projects. And so if you started doing stuff in 2011, it's 2021. You've had a decade of trying to figure out some things. It's plenty of time for multiple crashes and, you know, burnouts and finding a new passion and whatever in all of that. Talk a little bit about what that was like and why the space for just being a creative person sort of emerged out of all of that.
Yeah. So I think for years, so I guess let me start it like this. I think when so many people start chasing after the idea of entrepreneurship or self-employment or whatever you want to call it, you almost do it kind of like how I've said earlier, where you're like, you don't want the conventional lifestyle, right? You want to be able to make your own choices, to make whatever you want to make your money how you choose to. And sometimes, like to simplify that, is like you don't want like the 9 to 5 system. You don't want the machine, right? You're like, I want to make my own system, right? And so for
Mm-hmm.
me, that was the goal for so long that I got so focused on that all the time of getting clients and all this sort of stuff that I effectively created my own machine that I then got stuck in. So what it
Mm.
became was like at the start of the journey, I was just super excited to hopefully go freelance, to hopefully sit and be able to say, hey, I'm self employed. I make my money based off of me finding clients and doing all these different, odd creative jobs for them. And then once that started, you get in that mode where you're like, okay, now I'm even more afraid for it to go away. So then it becomes harder to almost keep the system going than it even was to get it in the first place because you can start getting clients, but then it's like, okay, well, how do I keep getting? How do I make people happy enough with the product that I give them or get the word out more? Or, do I need to spend money on marketing? Do I need to make more friends? Do I need to, all this sort of stuff that then becomes like the job of keeping the work around. So then that becomes like years and years of my life where I effectively got stuck in my own machine, where I was so zoned in on just going nonstop. And like I'm trying to get better at it, but I tend to be like the classic phrase workaholic, right? I love to
Mhm.
always be doing something. There's some days I really enjoy just like sitting and binging something and not doing anything. I'll still feel some guilt though at the end of the day, right? Something that I'm trying to get better at, but I love to always have something to work on. And so over the years, again, of doing freelance and all that sort of stuff, like I was just going nonstop to where it's the classic stop and smell the roses. Like I wasn't doing that at all. I was just trying to plant as many roses in this huge garden as much as possible. Then wanted to develop the next garden next to it, plant every rose that I could there. And I never stopped to look back and was like, oh, look at all this stuff that I've done. Like that's cool. Like you see it on the internet all the time, right? Where it's like, there's some inspirational image that says like, think of where old you would, be so proud of where you've come or, where you are now or whatever. And like,
Right.
I wasn't ever doing that. I was just like, I need the next client. I've got to pay rent because like it was not an overnight success. I mean, I know really nobody is, right? But like, it wasn't like I did a year's worth of grinding and freelance. And then I was like, oh, dope. I'm making rad money. Like, that didn't start happening until a couple years ago. And when I say rad money, I just mean like I'm, you know what I mean? Like not as stressed. You know what I mean? So it's still not like I'm, sitting and like, hey, I'm a millionaire now. I'll check out me and Gary V hang out every day.
Yeah,
It,
yeah.
it's
You can go to the dentist and you'll like
yeah,
be
yes,
okay.
yes. I can eat.
You'll feel like you should go to the dentist. I always think that's the thing. You're like an entrepreneur is like, I was recently visiting the dentist a little bit and, I was just like, he was like, "Oh, how long, like, you've been going regularly?" I'm like, "Well, I didn't when things are not so stable because
Yep.
the dentist is always like a question mark amount of money that this is gonna cost, or it's gonna lead me to more things. If I don't examine this, I won't know the bigger costs that come afterwards, you
Yeah.
know?"
And
Mhm.
it's
Uh,
hilarious that you say that because literally last year that was my step. Last year, I was like, I haven't went to the dentist in a while. That's probably a bad idea. Well, I need to go. And so yes, I love that you're like, hey, that's probably a reasonable gauge. 100% literally just lived that. But yeah, it wasn't
Amazing.
an overnight thing, and obviously I'm still not making millions, blah blah blah. But like It was just like,
Tell us about the like, so you hit kind of a burnout of just keeping the hamster wheel running. What were the lessons learned inside of all of that that have led you to find balance, and sort of like, what are you doing to make sure that you leave more space or enough space for your own things?
yeah. So, I mean, there's a ton of cliche things I feel like I could say of like, the stop and smell the roses thing, or to just slow down and make sure you're focusing on you. Whether it's like even physical health, the environment that you're in, all that sort of stuff. Like these are all things that I have made life shifts on in the last couple years since kind of like realizing that this all was effectively kind of a problem for me. But for me, like the big eye opener was actually in the midst of 2020. And it was right after the lockdown here in Ohio was lifted. And
Mhm.
thankfully, this is a good thing that then turned into kind of a bad thing for me. Once the lockdown got lifted, myself and my team actually got flooded with work. So that's awesome, right? I cannot complain about that, right? Because 2020 was a
Mhm.
wacky year for a lot of people. Um,
For sure.
but we get this flood of work, and unfortunately, the very first project we do in this like series of like 7 projects back to back, um, just kind of went off the rail. And I think it was because we went from 0 to 100 real quick. We just tried to jump back into exactly where we were, all this sort of stuff. So that project leads to the next one, leads to the next one, leads to the next one, and it domino effects where it makes something kind of negative about each project following. So for me individually, having went from just hanging around the house, watching Tiger King, doing some odd design jobs whenever someone could still hire me for that. Going from that with when it comes to the creative work realm, that was relatively no stress. There wasn't really any stress going on there, right? The chase for clients and stuff had to kind of halt. Yes, it was scary. When are we going to make money? Are we ever going to, how's this stuff going to work? There's a pandemic going on, but it was sort of this like, I mean, for everybody, it was just sort of this stop. It was just sort of this like almost weird forced vacation. So then going from 0 to 100 to diving right back into work, saying yes to all these projects again, and maybe not being that prepared for them, or just not prepared for the possible issues or problems that could arise, it just drained me. And by the end of this, like, I think it was like 2 months, we had like a project every week. By the end of it, I literally was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I literally was like,
Mm.
I don't like being a director. I don't like doing anything with video. I don't want to do this. And then it was actually a conversation with my friend Josh Emmerich, where he and I sat down and we had one last project on the list here to do. And he was like, "Well, let me ask you this." He's like, "What would make it fun and enjoyable for you to do? Let's take the budget part out. Let's take the client part out. Like, let's just take that out. What would make it fun for you to do?" And I just listed him all these ideas of like, well, this is how I'd want to make the project cool. This is what I would have fun doing. These are some details I would love to focus on. And he was essentially like, okay, then let's do that. Let's just do that. Let's be creative
Mm.
again. Let's step outside of the business machine for a second and let's let ourselves be creative. And that ended up being a super fun project. There was no stress, there was no problems, and it's a video that I'm super proud of. So what that then unlocked for me was it made me notice, oh, I've been caught up in my own machine where yes, for years I was so focused on how can I make money being creative. And then once I started to do that on whatever level, it then again, it was just the never ending cycle. It was the hamster wheel of doing that over and over where I kind of forgot like we're all supposed to grow, we're all supposed to evolve, you're supposed to change, you're supposed to level up. Just because you accomplish one thing that technically opens the door to what's the next thing you can accomplish. And I kind of forgot to use my like newly developed business skills and communication skills and all this sort of stuff to help myself grow my passion. So I just sort of sat back and was like, well, I use so much of my energy. And I've had this conversation with so many fellow, creatives, entrepreneurs, whatever you want to call them. I used so much of my energy for years to create for other people, disguising it as if I was creating for me. And again, at the beginning, I was, because I was
Mm,
accomplishing goals. I was excited. I was stoked to be
mhm,
freelance and all this sort of stuff. But at some point, again, we have to evolve and change. And I forgot that was a part of the process. So I
mm,
just sort of sat back and I was like, okay, I have to start doing things for me. I need to figure out the balance, the cliche work-life balance sort of thing, right? And that comes in many different forms. But for me, it was not just letting myself be creative for clients and making sure that while I was doing that and still trying to get new clients and trying to steal new deals and make money and all that sort of stuff, over here, I also needed to be having fun as a creative person again and making sure that I was doing things that I wanted to do, which then leads into finding the balance of, all right, I've got the client work. I know how to chase that. I know how to try and get that. There's ups and downs. I know how to go with that flow. Now over here, I want to pursue, the idea of filmmaking. I finally want to do, this podcast that I want to do. I want to do more personal creative projects that I know are going to keep me creatively fulfilled. While these things over here can feed some of that creativity, but it's the thing that's keeping me alive, the job, the career, it's so I feel like I just learned how to balance what I would label as career and passion.
mm. I like that. So to take it a bit further, just talk about what you found, because I mean, you kind of touched on it there, but how have you found like balancing creative paid work and fun work? Like, what does that breakdown look like?
So
And how do you decide when to do it for yourself versus when to do it for the money?
yeah. So for me, like, and it might not work this way for everybody, but for me, I've almost set these what I've been calling like pillars when it comes to client projects. So for me, these
Mhm,
three pillars look like creativity, like time and energy, and then money. So for me, when a project comes up, let's just say it's a client project. If a client project pops up, I'm going to look at those three pillars and see which of those things it kind of checks, right? So for instance, is this a project that is very high in the money part, right? It's going to be good pay. The time and money or the time and energy is whatever, but maybe the creativity is kind of low. Maybe it's not going to be that creative, but it's going to be a well paying job. I will run through that mental checklist and then determine if it is worth my time and energy, if it is worth my like, hey, I'm not going to raise the passion bar by saying yes to this project.
mhm,
So is it work? Right? Is it something I'm still going to go try and do a good job on, but is it mainly for the month? And I'm not so worried about it being creatively fulfilled by it, right? And vice versa. There could be a project that is super creative and I know I'm going to have fun with it, but monetarily, it might be pretty low. But if I could justify that creative part and say, hey, you know what? That's actually going to be fun. I'm not that concerned about how much I get paid for it. So I'm going to say yes. So what that then does, again, this is just for me, is I've learned to not attach my heart and soul to every single thing I'm a part of. Because again, for
right, right.
years, that was part of getting caught up in that machine. I wanted every project I created for anybody to be the most amazing thing ever and the best thing ever. And I had to love it. And if I didn't love it, there was something wrong and everything had to be perfect. I was chasing perfection. You know what I mean? So for me, I've learned that separation, that sometimes jobs, clients, whatever it is, opportunities, they're not always going to
Mhm,
check all of those boxes. But if you can run through a mental checklist before you say yes, of, well, it doesn't have to hit all of them. Which ones am I okay with it hitting? Then if you're okay with that,
mm,
then if you can say, I like that I don't need it to be super creative. I'm fine with getting paid. I don't need to be super creative. I'll say yes. Or again, it's not going to take a lot of time and energy. And I know it's going to be pretty creative and I'm not really going to get paid for it. That's still fine. So it's like I've just learned
mhm,
to detach my total wants and needs from, work or passion or whatever it may be, and kind of just like keeping myself in check before I say yes. It's not the game of like, I have to say yes to everything because while it feels like we do, especially when you're starting out and you're trying to navigate freelance and you're trying to like keep up with it, it definitely feels like you have to say yes to everything. But I would honestly argue that even at the beginning, I don't know if people should say yes to everything, because then you can end
Right,
up
right.
finding that burnout. You can just say yes to things that don't actually grow you, or don't actually fulfill you in some way. So it's like, for me, I feel like the earlier, if I would have identified that earlier, that kind of mental checklist, those quote
Yeah.
unquote pillars of not attaching my heart and soul to every single thing I did, I feel like it could have helped growth a little bit. And when I say that,
Yeah.
I don't mean that I don't care about a project sometimes. I still care no matter what. I still want it to be great, but just different
Hmm.
levels, because when
I think of it it reminds me so much of, I talk about this with our team sometimes, is knowing what your or with coaching clients, is like, if you think of yourself as like susceptible to a particular type of sickness, like I'm vulnerable. Like I feel like COVID's given us some of these language of like having risk factors or things like that, about just in general. You should know some things about yourself that would lead you to treat interacting with others differently. And in a professional life, it's the same thing of being like, some people are in a scenario where I like that you said money in it, because sometimes people talk about creative work like, it's just like
Hmm.
fun. And other times, like, people are like, but I do need to pay bills. And other people times people don't need to pay bills, and that's their situation.
Hmm.
But I think every person got to know their thing. I think, um, like in our world, sometimes you're like, I don't have the capacity to work with a client who's very specific about this type of thing. And that's just an emotional thing. Like I'm gonna take it too personally. I'm gonna care too much. I'm gonna like be too
Yep.
involved. And so you start to build these like barriers
Hmm.
around how you act. And I like that it's like you have to build pillars, and your pillars are maybe general enough that someone could take them with them. But you got to know yourself quite a bit and sort of understand, like, you're like, I need to not put my heart and soul into everything, but I'm going to put my heart and soul into everything. So I need to be really careful about what I let close enough to sort of suck that energy out of
Yeah.
me,
Exactly.
you
And
know?
it's just
Exactly.
identifying how much of your heart and soul goes into each thing, because where you set your bar. I know my bar.
Hmm.
I'm not going to treat one client differently from another just because one has more money. I'm not going to treat them
Hmm.
differently. I'm still going to care the same. So my bar is set at a solid level. But then it's just how much above that bar, how much of my heart needs to be attached to this project, how much of my soul needs to be attached. Because I know it's going to be there
Mhm.
regardless. But am I going to give
Hmm.
100% and drain myself? Or am I going to give 25% and get the job done and everybody's happy? You know?
Yeah. Well, Ross, speaking of, emotions and connections to things, like one thing that I've learned about being a, content creator is there are a lot of emotions that come with making things. You know what I mean? Like learning how to do a thing is tough because you have to be vulnerable, and you have to get comfortable doing that, and then you have to get comfortable presenting that thing because there's a lot of stuff that exists that we never get to see. And so I was wondering, how do you manage those emotions and those feelings as someone who creates multiple things? You know what I mean? Because I imagine it can become pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, the simple answer to this is definitely a thing I'm still working on. Definitely a battle that I'm having every day. Every time I share a short film on Instagram and it gets the no views or something. In my mind, it gets no views, and I'm like, oh my god, this is terrible. No one likes it. Was it a good idea? Am I a bad filmmaker? And that's a whole other topic for a whole other podcast about the battle of social media and all that sort of stuff. But it is a
Right, right,
thing that
right.
anybody creating anything, has to. That's just a new battle that we are as human beings are adjusting to, of seeing everybody's highlight reels all the time and knowing your imperfections and not knowing theirs and not knowing what's really going on with their day because they posted a perfectly filtered, edited photo and whatever. And you think that that's perfect. And you're looking at your imperfections and you're like, oh, I suck. I'm not bad at this, whatever. So
Hmm.
again, that's a whole other conversation. But for me, it's like, it's an ongoing battle for sure of understanding, like, something I've been trying to drill into my own head recently is done is better than perfect. Because I've
Mm,
definitely
Hmm.
uncovered over the years that I'm a perfectionist. I don't like,
mm.
we could sit and spend X amount of time talking. You could break down every short film that I've posted for the last like year. You could be like, tell me about this one. and I'll tell you like 19 things wrong with each of them, right? It's like, well, in my head, it was supposed to be like this, but I'm kind of stoked with how it ended up. Like the story was supposed to go this way. But I'm just learning that done is better than perfect, and getting started is better than waiting for the quote unquote perfect moment to get something started. Again,
Exactly.
things are going to evolve, things are going to grow, things are going to change. There's always going to be new challenges, and nothing's ever going to be perfect. So that's another thing that I'm trying to remind myself of is like, there's so many different avenues of things that I want to create, so many lanes I want to take, and all the, so many things, probably too many things, if I'm being honest. But I want to try everything that I can. I want to do everything that I can. And for me, I'm trying to learn that there's not really a perfect time to get something
Mhm.
started, to try something. It's not, I shouldn't wait to try and make movies until I have $1 million budget, because that
Exactly.
might not
You
ever
won't ever
happen.
have it.
You know what I mean? There's never
Yeah.
going to be a right time. And so like, I feel like when it's balancing those emotions of that, of realistically just a lot of like self-doubt, I think is the biggest emotion that probably a lot of creators battle with most often. So for me, it's like, I don't know. There's just so many different things. I love to, I love to attach my heart and soul to things, but again, it's finding the balance of not getting emotionally overly invested with stuff.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I'm also learning how to create. I'm also learning how to, I don't know, build my community is like the right phrasing, but even in how I use social media is being authentic as I can and being vulnerable and being open and doing things like the podcast to really strongly connect with people and build real friendships. Because in a way, it's all a web that's connected. So it's like if I can
Mm.
emotionally connect with somebody in one way, that could lead to a job in some other way or a creative endeavor in some other way or
Mhm.
a cool partnership. So yeah, like to bring us back around before I end up ranting a ton, it's an ongoing battle with the emotional part, and it's just not getting caught up in trying to make everything perfect and not assuming that an idea should work the first time. It's not,
We
it's, I battle myself so much on saying like, oh, I'd really like to start this brand or this company or this idea, but you know what?
Mhm.
It wouldn't exist tomorrow. So maybe I should, and it's just like that silly argument I think a lot of people have in their heads of why you should or shouldn't do something. So yeah.
It's funny that you say that, Ross. What like because you're kind of getting into some misconceptions that people have about like being a full time content creator or just like a entrepreneur. What are some misconceptions that you get often or that you've read or heard about being a full time content creator?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest one that comes to my mind is like the overnight success thing. Because,
Mhm.
again, especially with social media, you see someone launch their brand. So to you, in your mind, you're like, well, yesterday they didn't have it, and today they do. What the heck did they do that I'm not doing? And then it goes into, well, technically that was a 10-year overnight success. It
Mhm.
becomes that kind of funny saying where it's like, you don't know all the stuff behind the scenes that person has been doing or working on to get to launch day for their new company, their new brand, their new idea. And so I
Exactly.
do think, again, especially with social media adding to it, I think that's a misconception that, just because you see the result of something, you forget that there was work that went into it. And again, I'm saying that because
Mhm.
I get caught up in that. Like I see somebody launch
Yes.
something or do something, I'm like, man, how did they do that? I want to do that tomorrow. And it's like, well,
Exactly.
no, there's got to be time that's put into it.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
like so painful. It's painful. We sit around and talk about
We do that pretty often.
yeah, I was gonna say like D'Angelo may talking about a fashion company we should have started 2 years ago, or a podcast that we should have started 8 years ago. Not 8, 4 years ago,
Just
a
for
while ago.
yeah, just for
And then you see other people do something that seems similar, right? Like Adidas launches a shoe. They just relaunched their like Earth Day thing.
Mm.
And I'm like, that's a thing that I'm like, that was similar to what we had talked about. And it's gonna become mainstream and the trend's gonna be gone. And I'm gonna be D'Angelo and I be sitting old talking to each other, being like, we should have made that. It obviously, but now the trend's over, it's finished. And we just talked about it for the whole time.
Right.
We just like we're secretly geniuses who didn't put that stuff out into the world. And that seems really dumb. And it's like I think all like when you talked about D'Angelo, you asked about
Yeah.
misconceptions of being a creator all the time. It's like, Ross, you hit on this, and I think I have not worked with anyone who this wasn't in their top 5 like emotional struggles is social media, looking at other people's like the compare people are always comparing themselves to others and competing. Like people been doing that forever. Like
Yeah.
we always be like, I can lift a rock that's heavier than you and
Exactly.
whatever. Like
Exactly.
people be into that competition.
For sure.
But now it's like exacerbated. And I feel like the human brain isn't quite caught up to
No.
understanding how to we don't know. We know we're being tricked and we can't stop it.
Yep.
It's like
Yep.
we can't it's tuned to be perfectly addictive, perfectly depressing, perfectly aspirational, where I feel like if I keep watching more other people do cool things, maybe I will later do cool things because I'm watching them do it. And it's just not like Ross 10 years ago didn't have to deal with it. And maybe that's like the biggest advantage that you have starting something when social media wasn't quite like the algorithm that it is now. It wasn't smart enough to like defeat us the way that it can.
Right.
It started off as just regular code, right? Code is just code.
It was
does
just a
that.
feed. You're just like, oh, I post something and that's cool.
But
Then
like code, it just runs. It's code is code. Code is like, okay, this does this, and then it has variables. The algorithm is like, oh,
yeah,
you run this, and
Yeah.
then the algorithm learns like, oh, the person likes
yeah,
this, and so
yeah. And it's like it's in our this sort of like I think this was a tweet. Everything's a tweet. This was a tweet that was like popping off at the beginning of lockdown with COVID. And it was people were like, yeah, I worked on my medium screen all day. And then at night during the day, I take breaks to look at my little
Yeah.
screen from time to time. And at night I treat myself to my big screen and, still stay connected to my little screen
Right.
and then go to sleep. And I like the human, we're pretty close to getting to Wally and just living that life, getting in an ergonomical chair and
scooting everywhere.
be, watching that screen plugged in all the time.
Love it.
But you don't create much stuff
No.
in that world. And I think there's this like the people who create really cool stuff stay pretty disconnected,
That's
they stay like
yeah.
planned disconnected.
Right.
Yeah.
That's something that
What-
I've always tried to catch myself on. Like, because again, I know that like there was a handful of years where I just created stuff just so Instagram would like it. I would try and like do
Mhm.
trendy things that I knew were cool, and I wanted to like fit into this like clique or this niche or whatever. And I would just post so people thought it was cool. And eventually I was like, this is dumb. I don't want to do this anymore because again, I'm not actually being fulfilled. And that's a
Exactly.
huge thing with social media is like people, again, just like you said, Adam, like it's 100% accurate that our brains are not ready for all the stuff that we are doing. So that's why it's like I've tried to remind myself how important it is to catch myself in those things. Like I create my own algorithms and filters for my feeds. I don't let it dictate.
Mhm.
Like if I don't want to see something, I'm going to unfollow it, I'm going to mute it, I'm going to whatever. I've even gone as far as like it might not be somebody that I dislike, but if I know that every time they post something, I'm comparing myself so bad to where it negatively affects me, I will mute them.
Mhm.
So it's nothing against them, but I know what it is doing to me. So that's my counter. I'm like, okay, I right now cannot see this person, this entity's stuff without feeling something negative about myself. That
Mm.
means I should not be seen. I don't have to play the game and get more angry at them or get angry at them in general. Like I can combat that. Like I don't have to do what social media is telling me to do. Like there's mute buttons, there's unfollow buttons. Like you're not always going to get away from it or escape it, but that's just something I feel like a lot of people do forget is that you can kind of control, at least for the most part, stuff that you see on the internet and then how it then relates to you or makes you feel.
Exactly. So speaking of that, you know what I mean, and all the easy ways there are to compare yourself and all the different stimuli that we have going on, it's a very interesting time. You know what I mean? There's so many different opinions on what should be happening or how things should be run. And out granted, like to scale it back a bit, I don't think that it's as tumultuous as like the media would like for you to believe, either any direction, like right or left. They're like, man, people are attacking you or people are doing whatever. How important is it that your client's views match your own?
Yeah. Okay. So client alignment is gigantic for me. Like, and
Hmm.
that's been learned from a lot of just weird circumstances and bad projects that have happened over the years of not making sure that I align with my clients. And it's not so much like views of
Hmm.
like, we're not going to sit and be like, so what's your political stance or what's your this? So, it's not necessarily that, but
Mm,
it is more of like, well, who are you as a human being? And that can
Hmm.
span into all those things, right? The real views of stuff or whatever. But I'm huge on meetings. That was something from the very beginning that both Josh and myself, as we partnered up on stuff, we're always big on is we loved to communicate with people. We love to actually speak to people, not just answer an email thread and say, yes, totally, that number is awesome. Please pay us. Here's some creative. Let's book it. We
Hmm.
very early on realized like, no, like let's get to know these human beings and then see how we align. Do our views align? Do our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions align well enough? We don't have to be best friends, but quite frankly, like, are you somebody I want to work with? And nothing against you
mm,
if no, that's fine. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm not saying blah, blah, blah. You're just maybe we're not a good fit together. Right. So
mm,
yes, like client alignment is huge for me because I don't want to work with people who are super vastly different than me. And that doesn't mean that like we have to be the same. I'm just saying like, hey, if you're kind of naturally a rude person or aren't really respectful, I don't really want to hang out with you all day on a video production. I don't really, I don't want
Exactly.
to do, have fun email threads with you while I know you're treating somebody else terribly. Like, it's so, yeah, I don't know. I really like to align with somebody,
yeah,
even in how they act and even why they are coming to me in the first place. I want to align on that. I want to
yeah,
align on like, do they know why they're hiring me? Isn't just,
Hmm.
hey, make a design for me. Hey, come point the camera. Hey, do this. Because if that's why you're hiring me, then I know we don't align because that's not what I do. I don't point a camera.
Right.
I don't do that.
do you have I was thinking of in our world in late 2019, we made a list of all of our favorite people and we went and interviewed them and just asked them a bunch of like generic questions, not feedback about us, but just we're like, what's it like to be? We had a client as a health coach we do a lot of work with. We're like, what's it like to be a health coach? What do you hate about being a health coach? And just listen. And we learned a bunch from that. And we just did a bunch of like trying to figure out who our ideal client is when we actually have a pretty huge range of people that we talk to. And we came up with a bunch of things that were non-negotiables. And some of them were like, they pay their team well, they treat their employees well. And if they don't, I don't really want to work with you. Or if you have and we've been put to the test sometimes. We get inquiries from places that have a reputation of not. And we ask about that. We're like, so you have so seems to be like a reputation or whatever, we care about all of that. Tell me like what's going on. And sometimes the reputation is, we are satisfied with the answer that we get. Other times we're not. It's a really interesting thing to start for a creative person. I think D'Angelo, your point about like the media loves to fighting with somebody works really well for attention.
Hmm.
It's very fun to watch drama.
Oh yeah.
And so people fabricate it all the time.
For sure.
Our good friend Kanye West want to sell music for a little bit or clothes.
Yeah.
He go pick a fight with some other famous person.
Hold
Eh,
on, real quick. Sorry, Kanye. I know you're listening.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
just
yeah.
had to
Just no
use you as
offense.
an
We
example.
know what
Yes.
you're the best at doing that. No one
Yeah.
does that better than you.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You're like, we put a MAGA hat on, drop an album.
Hmm.
Fight with Drake, drop an
Hmm.
album. Wear a Confederate flag on my jacket, drop an
Fight with
album.
50 Cent dropping out.
Fight with 50 Cent, drop an album.
Yeah.
So like Kanye's not fighting with anybody. There's no music coming anytime soon right
Bingo.
now. He's kind of chill, making peace with people, whatever, right? I have been a guest on the What You Don't Hear podcast,
Yes.
and I want to talk about that for a little bit. Give the listeners context about where that idea came from. What do those discussions center around? What's inspired that?
Yeah. So the What You Don't Hear podcast is it's centered around like the fact that there are sides to people's stories that we don't get to hear, right? There are sides of people's lives and their growth points, their ups, their downs, their everything in between. Like there's just a lot of that stuff that you don't know. You don't get to hear about that stuff. It doesn't come up all the time in casual conversation. Even with close friends, you might not know realistically everything that they're going through or everything they have went through to get them to where they are now. So in the
Mhm.
show, like I really like to sit down with anybody. I'd say it's yeah, it probably flows a little bit more towards entrepreneurs, creatives, that sort of stuff. And just diving into, kind of what we talked about earlier, like the idea that not everything is an overnight success, right? Everything's a 10-year success or not even a success yet in the eyes of the person that you're talking to. And they still have tons of room that they want to grow. And I think the value that I want or wanted to at least put in the show and why I wanted to start it was, yeah, as you guys have learned in this, or as the listeners can probably hear, I love talking. I love talking to people a lot. And more so, I love connecting with people. And it was something that I just always noticed for years that I always wanted to have those like longer, deeper conversations that meant more than just like, hey, what was the weather like today? Or, oh, work sucked. That's cool. Well, it's like, I want to know why
Mhm.
did work suck? And then what do you think you could do differently to change it? And what would you want to do if you could leave work right now? Like, and just expand on all those like wild things that genuine conversation could go into. And it's like, I want the show to almost be a living sample or example of how easy it is almost to have those conversations and maybe inspire somebody to go and have more of those conversations. You don't have to do it for your own podcast, but understand that every single, and again, it's a cliche thing that floats around on the internet all the time, but every single person that you walk past, drive past, whatever, scroll past on the internet, they're living a life that you don't know about. And you
Mhm.
might see outwardly what they're sharing. You might see, the business that they're doing or the car that they're driving or the clothes that they're wearing or whatever. But there is a part to their story that you do not know, either that they're actively battling or actively dealing with or did when they were younger or whatever. So I just wanted to try and create a platform and a show where I can sit down with people, get to know them a lot better, and talk about those things, because those are the conversations I want to have when I'm meeting somebody anyway. I don't want to sit down and just be like, yeah, so you started a business. That's pretty cool, huh? It's like, I want to go into like, who were you as a kid? What was growing up like? And how did that even lead you to now? How do you
Mm.
get there? And again, in hopes that more people want to have those conversations, but even more so to inspire people to realize that like maybe a lot of us are have a lot more in common than we do, different. You know what I mean? When you hear somebody's
Exactly.
story and you're like, oh, I relate to that. Or oh, I experienced that same thing, or oh, I can't believe you experienced that. Here's what I experienced, and here's again how I can find that commonality with you. It's like if you just sit and you have those conversations or you listen to people's stories, you'll realize those things. You'll realize that we do have a lot more in common maybe than what we think, even if we come from insanely separate places. And that spawned from, it's not an original podcast. It's not, the only thing that does that in the world. It spawned
No
from
one's ever
yeah,
dove deep into someone's life
no. That's
before you
that's
started doing
what
it.
and that's
No.
why
Yep.
I'm a
Yep.
millionaire.
Yep. Yep.
That's why I have a lot of money.
Ah,
Yeah, yeah.
so I'm glad we stole those questions from you too.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly. But no, like
No, but
that's the thing. It's like
yeah.
that just came from me hearing other podcasts do that. But I also was like, well,
Mhm.
all these podcasts are also super famous people talking to other super famous people. So like I don't want like I don't know. It's like cool, I can't do that. But like I don't want to just listen to the same podcast that's Brad Pitt talking to Leonardo DiCaprio for you know what I mean? It's like, all right, cool, those are cool conversations, but everyone has an important story, whether they're famous or not, whether they're successful or not, like whether they're on their trajectory to success. Like, I don't know. So, I don't know. I just wanted to create a show where I was able to do those because I was totally inspired by, you know, tons of other shows that do that and shared success stories or fail stories or whatever. And I know what it did for me. I know how it made me think. I know how it literally shifted the way that I see things. And I know it's become a silly thing to say, But I've learned a lot from podcasts. I have. Like, I have learned a lot from just listening to people talk about stuff. And I think it's a lot of life and perspective and feelings and emotions. So I just wanted to make that for myself. I wanted to have my own show that did the
Uh,
same thing.
Yo,
Go ahead.
well, I was gonna say we try really hard with this. We get to, in our professional life, we get to interact with, not that this is our professional life, but in other parts of our professional life, we get to interact with so many other people who are doing really cool stuff in their own way. They've figured out a way to like make it theirs, but they're doing it in a way that isn't going to lend itself to fame or probably a lot of recognition, or they don't play the games necessary to win awards or be recognized by the city for being something great at something or whatever. They're not going to do all the industry stuff, but they're doing a great job on their own. And those are the stories that are actually accessible. Like anyone can do that if that is your standard for success.
Right.
And so you don't have to be well connected to get rolling. You don't have to be well funded to get rolling. And I think it's important for people to start to like the last episode that we just did was with one of my friends and local bartender, Derek Reno, who has an amazing story that I've got to know over the years. And his story is very accessible. And because he's been doing it for on his own for 6 years, and you're the same way, you're like, anyone can match your career trajectory if they give themselves to something for 10 years and start from not going to college. Like that's accessible. What's not accessible is people acting like they made it all on their own, but actually they like got an MBA from Harvard and they're super interconnected and their dads are at the country club with the other investors and they raised $750,000 from their like friends who are also venture capital. Like
Yeah.
there's just so much of that on the internet that you're like, I'm never going to be like this. And you're like, you can't. It's not possible to be like that
Mm-hmm.
unless you're like somebody. But I'm always curious as a farm kid who taught himself everything and has a business that is funded by the customers of ourselves up until we got PPP funds at the beginning of COVID, which were very useful for us to continue to do this
Mm-hmm.
and also pay our rent. Those things were important. I always mention that because it's like, if I don't mention that stuff, then people think that we bootstrapped it up until for 7 years.
That's
And then COVID hit and the government like gave us a little bit of like a little boost.
Drew. Ross. Thinking about and guest you had on your podcast. That was one of the ones that I watched. His first name is Drew. He has a very interesting last name. I believe he was Nigerian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dingabaganese.
Yep. That's a wonderful name.
Meaning
But you ask a lot of good questions, and you get the guests talking like what goes into you crafting the questions and the atmosphere to make the guests so comfortable. Like, is it just you? Do you have a team? And like, yeah, just kind of speak to a little bit of that for us. Cause me and Adam, like we do this and I'm just like, there's a lot of stuff that I do that, or like that he does that people won't, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You don't think about, but you're like, oh, that is something that somebody should do,
Right.
something that needs to be done.
Yeah. So I wish I had a team. Very badly. I wish I had a team to help take care of some of that stuff. Um, it's a one-man show. So when it comes to setting the stuff up, shooting them, editing them, cutting all the social content, all that sort of stuff. Right now that's all me. Now that I got help, figuring out the technicalities of things in the setup process of getting some advice and opinions from like, hey, what gear should I use? What gear do I need? How should I set it up to make it, look or sound the best, all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to actively running the show and producing it, that's all me. So when it comes to the conversations, like for me, I literally just try and make them as natural as possible. I don't prep questions ahead of time. I didn't really tell them like, hey, this is what we're going to talk about or anything, because we're there to talk about them. And I think whether people like to admit it or not, even the shyest of people in the right circumstances, everybody kind of likes to talk about themselves. Everybody likes when you get the chance to, not everybody loves to go out of their way to talk about themselves and say, hey, look how awesome I am here. Listen about me, hear about me. But when they're
Right.
given that comfortable environment to say, hey, this is about you and your thoughts and your feelings. It's not just about how cool you are, how awesome your business or creative endeavor is, or whatever. This is about how you feel. This is about how you think. This is about what you've been through and what you want to go through at some point, right?
Mhm.
So when I sit down with people, like it really is just like I try to have as natural as a conversation as I possibly can, where whether I'm getting to know them for the first time, naturally there's a lot of questions that are going to pop up in the conversation. Even if it's a friend that I know, like Drew that you brought up, I've known him for a couple of years, but I don't know him. Know. Those are things that came up in our casual conversations that were like, oh, tell me about childhood, or tell me about this or that or whatever. So it's like
Mhm.
we have that understanding, at least, that hey, this platform means we might take some of those deep dives into things you don't often talk about. But I love just to make it an environment that is, it's not some weird hot seat Q&A, promotional tool sort of thing where, whatever. It's more so like, tell me about you. If we get to end up talking about your new song that you released, if you're a musician, we'll get there. But, I don't
Mhm.
want to start with that. I'm like, hey, you just dropped a new song this week. So tell me just about that. So yeah,
Right.
I don't know. It's like, and like a compliment.
No, it's
Yeah.
really cool. I mean, as a recipient of the process, it's I could tell you have so much intention in it, even if you're not like, um, announcing it as a guest. You didn't announce it to me in a way that's like, here's exactly what I'm trying to do, X, Y, and here's like what the point, what we're trying to get to. It was very much, we had a long episode. I remember being in here being like, oh, we were going for a while. And I remember being like, oh, this is like if I went and got drinks with someone and we talked for like 2.5 hours and we were like, oh, let's get appetizers and kind of like nibble on stuff and just like talk. It was that. And when that's going on, I don't care about it taking 2 hours because I'm like, yeah, I love getting coffee with people.
Yeah.
If you're gonna try and make me like market myself for 2 hours, I'll be pretty tired of that whole thing. No, but it's really cool to see, um, you kind of put yourself into all of that. How do you measure adding another side project like that? I was like, I'm gonna call it a side
Mhm.
project. Is that fair?
No, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just didn't know like this. There are things that I do that feel like a side project that I actually also sit on my business plan. So sometimes people think of it. Sometimes people are like, oh, that's cute. I'm like, that's on part on. I'm doing it on purpose. Um, but the so how do you manage like balancing burnout from work, balancing emotional, like caring too much about things, fighting or succumbing to the urge to go check how many likes your video got on Instagram or how many downloads the episode just got or all of that stuff? Like, how do you balance spinning up new stuff?
Yeah. So this is gonna sound really I don't know, life coach guru person. But like
Perfect.
for me, I've narrowed it down to just understanding my why. Like understanding why I like to do these things and then determining, does this feed into my why? Does this branch off of my why? Is it something that sort of sounds cool that I sort of want to try? Or is it something that I see the intention, I see the purpose within, I know what I want out of it or what I want it to do, you know? And again, it's like, I think I kind of, I feel like I have an addiction to making things, to doing things, because there's literally just any chance I get, I'm like, yep, I want to work with this person on that. I want to do this with that person. I want to do these things by myself and I want to start this idea. And sometimes it takes very little to get that out of my system. Sometimes all it takes is realizing that I didn't actually want to start that coffee shop. All I needed was to see a logo that I designed in Photoshop. And then once I did that, I saw it exist sort of. And I realized, oh, this was just a creative idea that I kind of wanted to make as an art project real quick. I don't actually want to figure out how to make a coffee shop. It's like judging, even the level of, do I really want this thing to be real? Do I want to, is it just kind of an art project? And, I don't
Mhm.
know if there's really like a practical set of thought or advice that I could give for that almost because, again, for me, it has just come down to understanding my why. And, that sort of feeds into like the pillars that we talked about earlier of,
Yeah.
it's like realizing like, okay, like, cool, I've got to record the podcast this week, and then I've got to cut the content for that. And then, okay, but I've also got this client project at the end of the week, but I also need to still work on this script for this movie I want to make. And then I need to shoot a short next week, all this sort of stuff that I'm getting the opportunity
Mhm.
to do. It is a lot to balance for sure. But I just feel like I've not perfected it. But I feel like for me, I've just become so centered and balanced on why I like to do things that it's
Mhm.
raised my confidence in saying yes or no and being sure about it. Does that
Yeah,
like
it's real. Yeah, that's the acceptable answer. We'll be cool. It's like
Yeah, that
like, "Is that good?" You're
we'll
like,
take it.
"No, that's, try again. You can do better." No, I think during the lockdown and our business in particular served a lot of small businesses, and it felt for the first, like, couple weeks of after lockdown, we were just like people were like, "Hey, can you help me get my website updated so I can sell Zoom recordings, I guess, or whatever?" Like, people were like, "I don't even know what to do right now, so try and sell something." And, we would just be like, "Yeah, how much do you feel like paying?" And people were like, $700 is good. We're like, "Cool, we'll help." Like, I don't
right.
know. None of we us know what to do. Um, I think during all of that, we lost a good chunk of teammates. We went down from a team of 12 to a team of 5, and we went from uh, you know, a bunch of things that I was like really proud to have built or worked on building or trying to build and just go away. And during all of that, you talked about getting connected to why is I got really connected to like once everybody was good, everybody was like, okay. Um, we had a little bit of time to be like, all right, so what are we trying to do here? Like, what's the point of all of this? And you don't often get a chance to hop off the hamster wheel that way and think about it. And it's funny because sometimes there's a big part of this is time management, energy management, and financial management, and all these other things. But if you're not connected to why you're doing, if I would say it a different way, if you are connected to what you really care about, it sort of sorts itself out. Like if I care so much about working on this and I don't have much time or energy left over for other things, I'm either going to figure out how to make enough money off of this or I'm going to charge more for the other things per hour because I'm giving fewer hours to it and it's got to work out. And I think sometimes people get so like into the mechanics of it all, of like life hack, productivity hacks, time management, energy management, whatever. And it's like just like fill your life with really good stuff and that you care deeply about. Be ready to let go of stuff when it's time to care about something else really deeply. And your time management stuff figures stuff. You start being like, I had a, fr- I had a, I had a, we had a business coach or sort of a leadership life coach. I don't know. It was one of those like hybrid guru people, which was useful. I don't have one of those right now, but at the time it was really useful. Who said like, what would make you want to get up an hour earlier? Like, not saying like, what time should you wake up? What's your morning routine? Be like, what would you want to get out of bed at 5 in the morning for? Because you're just stoked that you even be allowed to go do the thing or have a chance to do it.
Right.
Um, it's just like it's a whole different question. Um, I want to ask you a little bit about inspiration for you.
Mhm.
Like for you, what does it look like for you to where does inspiration come from? I guess really I have two questions for you. I have two topics, and I'm going to fuddle around a question to get you to talk about them. Is inspiration and then also decompression of where does the inspiration come from for you? Where do you go find it? What do you pay attention to find like new ideas and new things to infuse your creative process? And then the flip side of that is where does relaxing and release and the deep breath and the relax come from for you?
Yeah. So it's funny because I feel like the thing that's immediately coming to mind is those two things intertwine a lot. So I'm not, at least right now, this could change at some point, but like uh I'm not so much that type of person who's like, oh well, when I'm in work mode or creative mode, I'm doing this. And then when I'm resting, I'm only doing this and I'm not engaged in this at all. It's like, for me, those two things are almost mutually exclusive, and the only difference is maybe I'm not doing it for a client, or I'm not on a set somewhere, or I'm not in a meeting, or I'm not physically somewhere else other than, my couch or my bed watching a movie. But I feel like at all points in time, I am susceptible and open for inspiration. It's like
Mm.
there isn't really a time where I'm like, all right, I'm gonna rest right now. It's like, all right, I'm gonna relax and rest. But I'm really gonna watch a movie that I know is gonna make me feel a certain way, or I want to watch this new movie or new show that I haven't, gotten to watch yet. And I kind of go into it knowing that it's going to inspire me in some way, right? Um, but for me, it's like I don't even know when it comes to the inspiration stuff. I don't know if there's necessarily even, one or a couple things that I could narrow it down to. Because I also don't know if my inspiration things are different than most people's, like if I will turn on a movie that I know is great, or a movie or a show that I know is probably going to be awesome. And I go into
Hmm.
it knowing that I'm going to be inspired in some way. I'm not looking for one particular thing of like, oh, this character is really cool, or this looks really cool, or whatever. But it's like I don't have particular things that I could tell you, but I don't want to give the cheesy answer of like inspiration is everywhere for me.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in between, I
What's
think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talked about film as a way of being inspired, but also relaxing, but also like, um, no, that's really cool.
Yeah, and
It makes a lot of
it's the
sense.
same thing with podcasts. It's like I'll listen to, different forms of podcasts. Like I kind of categorize them as like, is this an educational podcast or is it an entertainment podcast? Yet when I'm listening to both, I'm being inspired by them no matter what. It's like I could listen to a podcast about people telling their true life scary stories. And yes, I'm just doing that for entertainment, just to kind of listen to something. But also there's so many stories that I hear that I'm like, that makes me think of turning this into a short film, and this is how I would do it. So then I'm going to note that down real quick and save it in the idea bank later. So yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
it's definitely, it's podcasts, it's movies, it's shows, it's conversations with people. I love having brainstorm sessions or ideation sessions with people when maybe there isn't even an end goal. It's like whenever I can just sit down, and if we just said, all right, we're going to sit down and let's just talk and think, like, awesome. We're not thinking towards something. We're just talking in general. And so yeah, I don't know if I have a direct answer to that almost, but it is just sort of like I feel like my brain is kind of, for better or for worse, always in go mode, or always at least on standby, to where if inspiration does strike, I'm like ready to grab it and at least save it for later if I can't immediately work on it then.
Hmm.
Mm.
So Ross, like, we've talked a lot about the podcast, and music, not music, I mean, video equally, but like now we're kind of in the throes of like the podcast. And as you've recorded episodes and, done your thing, what is it that you learned about creatives or humans?
That hmm, through doing the podcast, having all those conversations, if there's one thing, or kind of even a collection of things that I feel like I've learned, I think it really is, I know I kind of touched on it earlier, but I think it really is that everybody has something important or special about them that you might not
Mm.
know. And
Mm.
even though, like, I think everybody has uniqueness about them, and at the same time, everybody has things that we are all so alike within. Because there have been so many conversations I've had on the show where, again, it's like they could be explaining a nearly a totally different life growing up than I had. But there's still going to be so many like thoughts or feelings or emotions or things that they go through. I'm like, oh, you experienced that? Like I experienced that same thing. And now we're connected. And I think for me,
Mm.
maybe the larger lesson has almost been like the power of connecting, the power of like genuine connecting.
Mm.
I'm not talking connecting on LinkedIn. I'm not talking, following on Instagram or DMing back and forth. I'm talking like stripping it all back to the before time when people would just sit and then talk and communicate and all that sort of stuff. Like that, I think has been maybe my favorite part, maybe my biggest thing that I've learned is like the power of connection because, it's like even Adam and Allie, I had them both on the show and I didn't know them before. We had mutual friends. Um, and I
Yeah.
genuinely was like unsure. I was like, man, I hope they think I'm cool and hopefully I can get a good conversation. And hopefully they're not like, oh, I'm doing this like weird dude from Columbus's podcast, I guess, whatever. But it's like, it's like when I do things like that and I'm like, oh man, I just want to, I want to connect with these people. I want to be their friend. I want to, get to know them better. And by doing that, by actually talking to them and communicating, for me, it's like I get to leave so many of those conversations, whether we're talking every day or hanging out every day or not. I leave some of those conversations being like, wow, I just made a new friend. And it's not for any reason of like, and now I can use them for this. Like it's not that, it's not, I think it can get muddied up like that sometimes.
Yeah,
In the
for
world of
sure.
business, creative, social media, all that sort of stuff. Like there's always an ulterior motive. And for me, I
Hmm.
think it's just been cool to learn that like, yeah, like you can really, really connect with people, make new friendships or strengthen ones you already have by just genuinely, authentically getting to know somebody without an ulterior motive. And just by sitting down and
Hmm.
listening to them or having them listen to you. And there's so much that you can connect with people over, whether it even seems like it or not. It might not
Hmm.
seem like when you go to meet somebody that, oh, we're going to have a lot of stuff in common. You might be like, dude, we're not going to have anything in common. I don't know what we're going to relate on. And once you start talking, you're like, wow, we've had so many
Mm.
similar experiences or we've had so many similar emotions or, whatever it may be. I don't know. There's just power in connection. And again, we are all more similar than we are
Yeah.
different.
I think so much. I don't remember the dude's name, but the dude who started Humans of New York, and I listened to an interview that he did, and he kind of walked through how he asked questions of people to get, his captions are always really compelling, and he sort of uses portraits and told people stories. And I say just like it's easy, but to do bring up a random person from an audience and get them to cry in 3 questions almost universally. And it was because he just understood how to connect with people in a really quick way, a lot of different types of people. And you start to realize the universalness of our experiences as humans. It was like we all feel really sad about stuff and we all feel whatever. Yeah, no, you do a great job of that. Your podcast is I haven't heard a lot like it. I mean, I know a lot of people like dive into people's stories, but you do so in a way that's very different and unique, which is really is cool. It's really cool.
Mm.
Yeah.
I like it a
Thank
lot,
you.
man.
Yeah. No, I definitely need to hear that. I definitely appreciate that. 'Cause that's how I want it to feel,
Yeah. Yeah. Do amigo.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah, yeah. For your thing, bro.
D'Angelo we have a choreographed dance that we do at the end. And I just want to be like who's leading this time.
I
So,
love it.
um, towards the end of the podcast, we go through rapid fire questions, and we're going to give you a special edition of rapid fire questions.
Right.
Listeners know that we always ask the same 5 questions
Hmm.
and the same one
Two,
question,
two,
two
two and a half.
questions,
Yeah.
2.5 questions.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and the first one's always like the most iconic one, and we're not going to do that with you. So sorry. But I want to know, you mentioned listening to podcasts a lot.
Yeah.
I would love to hear from you your favorite podcasts to listen to that aren't like on iTunes top 10 podcasts,
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
what are the ones that you're listening to that you're like, I really connect with this, whether it's entertainment or education?
Yeah. So I can give
Maybe
you,
give us like a top 5.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I can give you a couple. And even though like, they're from well-known people, it's not, I don't think it's a top five in the iTunes charts. It's not what everybody's go-to probably is like the Joe Rogan podcast or something silly like that.
Yeah.
Um, the two main ones that really stick out to me are short story long. If you guys are familiar with Chris Path drama from Robin Big, Fantasy Factory, those MTV shows.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah. So he has a podcast. He hasn't done it since the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm hoping to make the comeback. But truly, his podcast is kind of the format of mine. It's just, it's just with famous people. Um, Whatever that means, I suppose. Um, but it was one that really showed me kind of the authentic dive when it does come to kind of entrepreneurship or creative endeavors that shed a lot of light on, showed me similarities that I have with these people. It showed me their paths weren't that different than mine or anybody else's. And so, yeah, whether it's entertainment or education, short story long is definitely one of my favorite ones for a multitude of reasons. And the second one is probably one that not a lot of people have heard of at all, unless you're a fan of pro wrestling. So there's a podcast by a pro wrestler. His name is Colt Cabana, and it's called The Art of Wrestling. And again, since pandemic, he hasn't really been doing it as much, but it is one of the very first podcasts I ever started listening to back before podcasts were like really cool to listen to, I suppose.
Mhm.
This was like 2011, 2012, something like that. And again, it was these unedited, raw and real conversations. And then, of course, it's in the world of pro wrestling. So he's speaking a lot with other pro wrestlers and stuff like that, which again,
Mhm.
surface level of that, you're like, oh, if I don't care about pro wrestling, why would I care about that? And it's like, well, it's not just people sitting and talking about throwing each other around in a ring for 2 hours. He would talk to them about them. He would talk to them about their
Mhm.
lives. And that I feel like was almost the first introduction I got into, hearing these people that maybe I would be seeing on TV, hearing the just crazy ups and downs that they've had in their lives and emotional trauma and all this sort of stuff that again that they've had to fight through to be who they are, success or no success, because he would also interview
Mhm.
people who were on the rise, people who weren't famous on TV or something like that, so it was like that, that was a thing I think really at first introduced me into, oh, this isn't a weird radio show where it's some Q&A or it's not some talk show where it's kind of formatted a little bit. This is real authentic conversation.
Mhm.
And so,
Mm,
yeah, I think those are two that
that's cool.
really,
Yeah.
really like stick to me that I would say like are like ones that I'm like, yeah, this is like a part of me and who I am, or if, again, it's silly to say like, oh, podcast changed my life. But if I were to credit a couple of changing my perspective, opening me up to more people's perspectives or
Yeah.
learning more in that way, just learning about life. Yeah, I would say short story long and art of wrestling. And I could throw you a loop
That's
and
cool.
say a show called Radio Rental for some crazy, wacky, paranormal, true crime stories. So that's a whole other side of
Mm.
things. But
Okay.
Hey, well, wrestling is cool, man. The wrestling culture's kind of grown a bit over the past few years, so that's nice.
yeah,
Um, but moving right along, we usually do, you know, top 5 favorite songs from like 2000 to 2009. But you had a special request, you know, that I was really excited about as somebody who grew up afraid of like horror movies until The Ring came out, and I was
okay,
like, "Oh, this
okay,
is hilarious." It's a very funny movie, not intentionally, but it's like extremely. It's like, man, I cannot stop giggling.
right.
But um, Ross, name your 5 favorite horror movies of all time.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay. In no particular order, The Shining,
Oh man, Stanley
Hereditary,
Kubrick.
Grave Encounters, um, oh, this got so tough. Tremors.
Is that a
That's
scary
kind of
movie?
on the edge, I suppose. I think it's technically a horror movie,
Right,
but a
right.
goofy and
Good
fun one.
classic
But I
film.
still love it. And then I would say to throw it back to like classic stuff, A Nightmare on Elm Street. That was one of my
Mm.
early
Okay,
favorite, that and Child's Play, Chucky.
How'd you get into how'd you get into horror as like a what was your introduction into?
Yeah, it's funny, like, because it's like I don't know what this even means, but like I think it's fun that I kind of like people know me as like a big horror fan. I'm kind of like the horror guy. So people, I get asked that question, and look, I literally
mhm.
don't know. I really don't know. I
You
just
just found
I
yourself
literally
there?
just remember, like, as a kid, for some reason, I was allowed to watch horror movies, and I remember going to, video rental stores, every weekend, every Friday to rent, this handful of mostly scary movies, and just
Mhm.
binging them all weekend. And whatever was on TV, I was infatuated by it. And my thing with with my mom and I was like we would watch ghost hunting shows every single week together. Like I don't know. Like I really can't remember like what the first introduction was, or even what it
Mm.
was that even made me like it. Because I would dare say horror movies now have a lot more intention and purpose maybe than they did when I was a kid. There's a lot more just kind of
Mhm.
slashers and craziness or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Sorry to disappoint you with not this like really cool origin story,
No,
but
I'm just so I think it's so yeah, I think it's how people get into anything is always interesting, and it's, sometimes things just find you.
Yeah, man.
yeah.
Yeah, scary movies, listen, like, have you seen any of those,
No,
Adam?
I so I was like, um in we talked earlier about knowing what you're sensitive to, and like I watch there's a show called Ghost Rider back in the day,
Oh,
and I'll
man.
like have nightmares about this like kid show that had some spookiness to
That's
it. And
funny.
it's like I just don't like every fall people try to watch Hocus Pocus or whatever. And I'm not saying that Hocus Pocus is a scary movie to
Okay.
me,
I was gonna
but
say
like
what a
it makes its way into a nightmare somewhere.
oh
Like my
Mhm.
wow.
brain has a
Huh.
sensitivity, and it's not Hocus Pocus. It's just like terribleness of something happening.
Exactly.
And so if I'm ever watching things like that, it's gotta be like artistically driven. Like the Jordan Peele stuff is like he's got a lot of, there's a lot of intention into it that's not just silliness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then and I've got to be able to like spot it.
Mm.
Like that has to make sense to me.
Mhm.
And then it's gotta be or it's silly, and I've got to do it with people in like a room where maybe we're like, "Oh, I'm gonna, like, go grab a drink too," and, like, not pay that close of attention. Like, I'm not like I
Yeah.
can't do it, I just don't do it. I don't know any of like, everything you said is like, I
Tremors?
intentionally don't watch that.
Yeah,
You seen
No, I
Tremors?
don't
Tremors
watch
is a fun one.
anything.
Tremors isn't scary. Tremors is just a
They're just big
fun,
worms.
silly movie.
I've seen so I'm not I know everything that you're talking about
Okay,
as, like, a
okay.
person who exists in culture, but
Yes.
I won't
You're not down?
Tremors, I wouldn't avoid on purpose, but if someone was like, "Hey, let's go watch this new thing that's out," I would say, "No." I would not go.
That's fair.
In high school, friends would go watch stuff, and I'd be like, "I'm gonna go watch a different movie in a different theater by myself.
Oh, wow.
Catch you all afterwards."
That's fair.
Because I'm just not gonna. I just would. I
Can't
can't.
handle it. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
I'm
sensitive.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
used to act like
It's
that.
a food allergy, but to a genre of film.
Yeah, I used to be afraid of, Thriller by Michael Jackson like that. You ever seen that?
Yeah.
That's fair.
Who is it?
Thriller? But,
By who?
it's a guy named Michael Jackson.
No, I don't. What was he
Anyway.
doing?
No, man. That one used to they used to terrify
Did you
me.
think I really didn't know who that was?
No,
Did I have
no,
you for
no,
a second?
no, I said,
Okay.
have you seen it, the
No.
video? Because it's
Yeah.
scary.
No,
I
I've
don't
seen
know.
the I've
Okay,
seen the
okay.
video.
It's scary, man.
Yeah. Oh,
Ross,
yeah, you go.
let's say a future entrepreneur,
Yes.
or just somebody who was listening that may want to start, just their own thing. What ideas would you give them, or what advice, not ideas, because they have to pay for those, but what advice would you pass on to them?
I would say probably in a few different points that we hit throughout this episode, honestly. I would first tell them to figure out their why. Like whether that's just noting down different reasons why you wanted to do something, but like
Mhm,
figure out why you want to pursue the things you want to do, whether it's one thing, whether it's multiple things, because I do think even if you want to pursue multiple things, if you know your why, that's the thing that branches them all together. Multiple things
mm,
doesn't mean separate things, at least to me, right? They can
mhm,
all have the
mhm,
same core. They can all branch back together.
Mm,
Um, that's at least my excuse as to why I do 100 different things, right? Because I know my core
yeah.
piece. But I would say figure
that's
out your
fair.
why and then like identify and figure out who you are.
Mm,
Understand like, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the why, but like figure out like, is it, do you want to entertain? Do you want to educate? Do you want to provide? Do you want to, build other things for other people? Because I also think that's a whole other part of this. It's like there's freelance and
Mhm.
there's entrepreneurship, and they're very, very similar, but they're also different. So it's like,
Mm,
I could sit and like tell somebody like, and I do have this conversation with people. It's like, cool, you want to be a part of video production. Do you like being a part of the team or do you want to lead the team? You know what I mean? Like, do you want to create the business and do that side of things, or do you want to come in and be a camera operator or something? Nothing wrong with either side, but identify that at the beginning. So then you kind of know, again, the why. Why are you moving in certain directions?
mm.
Why do you maybe not need to be in the client call? Or do you need to be in it because you want to learn certain things and grow certain ways? So yeah, I think for me it's figure out, try to identify a why, and that might change over time, but try to identify a why and then try to relate that to understanding like who you are and what you want to do. Like I think that's I know those are so bland. Um, but that's the biggest thing, because and I say that because tons of people dive into this stuff not having any really idea why they want to do it. It's just that it sounds cool, or they don't want to work the 9 to 5, or they don't want to do this. And again, it's like I dove into it almost directionless. But along the
Mm,
way, my why was kind of always there. It just maybe took me a moment to uncover it. Right. And I think everybody
yeah.
has that in them. I do think that everybody has something unique or purposeful within them, but it's up to you you have to figure out how to unlock that, so
That's the true. Well, I feel like one of the weirdest, especially being self-taught, where you feel like you're trying to like do a bunch of extra work to catch up to baseline. Like you feel like I gotta do like 10 things. I gotta prep a lot before and I gotta do a lot of stuff afterwards. And where you're like, I probably shouldn't be here. You tell that it's very easy to feel that way when in reality you have just as much reason to be here. Anyways, that idea of like finding out who you are, understanding your why or passion or purpose or all those things like that is like something to be um it's like you catch it more than it is you dictate it. And people often feel like I need to go write out my mission statement to make the biggest difference in the whole world. And that's really cool, but people, you gotta find it. Like you show up in 100 different places. You kind of watch how you respond, take your experiences, personality, brain chemistry, all that stuff comes to play, and you sort of find out who you are through all of it. And it's like you find it a bit like it's hidden in there somewhere, and you got to find it and like let it out
Mhm.
versus craft it and create it and make it. I think so many people end up having like a really compelling, like, my why is this, or I am this person, but you gotta go exploring a bit
Mhm.
in all of it. Is there anything we always ask this as like a follow up to that last question, advice for somebody who's just getting started. Is there anything that you found to be cliche advice or um, just common cliches that are always thrown out often in entrepreneurship or freelance or creativity that for you just didn't really work? You're like, that's not really been my experience.
That's a really good question. Um, hmm, that's a tough one. And I guarantee I have an answer, but it's just not coming to
Maybe
me.
about I'll like frame it in a different way, in a way thing that we've talked about a lot is are there things that you see maybe on social media or you hear other business owners or entrepreneurs talk about where you're like, that might be misleading to people?
Yeah,
Where you're
yeah.
like, that's not really how it works.
I think, I mean, I don't know if I should like name drop it and pinpoint it to like one person, but there's no, call them
Well, we love drama. It's good for
out.
listeners. So if you could say something terrible, I think Derek like talked about how he didn't like Beyonce in the
We're
last
That's the name
episode.
of our episode
Yeah, it's
for
like,
the last
yeah,
one.
yeah. I was like, that's
Who do we hate? The
uh
title of the episode.
most controversial thing, and then that's how we clickbait, and that's how we get
That's perfect.
download because
Ross says blah
podcast.
blah blah.
Well, because like podcast demographics and numbers are very misleading in
Mhm.
that there's no like uniform way in which they're measured, even if there's some. And there's still not a very good answer of like, if someone's podcast has 10 million downloads, is that a 3-second listen? Like, does that count?
Right, right.
Like, is it because it's playing when my phone's on silent and I just accidentally had things running? It's running up the score
Mhm.
because it's not. You might go release a podcast that has you can tell nobody and get 6 listens on the first episode.
That's a fact.
And it's
People
like,
just bump into it.
yeah, you're like, or bots will or something like that. So
Now
no one's talking about
now you're
that.
making me worried about mine.
Anyway,
I'm like, is anybody actually listening to mine? No, but
yeah.
for real though, I think I have a very 50-50 opinion on like people like Gary Vee. I think some of what he says is at a base level like good for people to hear, and if they find inspiration in it, then great. I would rather somebody be inspired and motivated by whatever than nothing at all, and to not find inspiration. But I also think that he feeds into the fabricated entrepreneurial culture that has kind of just become cool nowadays. And it's like, I think a lot of stuff like that on social media is very contradictory, where one post,
Mm,
those types of people are telling you that if you're not posting every day and creating new content on TikTok and doing all this stuff, that you're lazy and you're out of it and you're just going to fail. Then the very next post, 5 minutes later, they'll say that you need to be authentic and you need to be organic and you need to create what just comes naturally to you. Well, those two things are
mm,
contradictory. Those are two very different things that you're telling people.
for sure.
So it's like, I think, yeah, I think that that sort of advice is something that I don't really enjoy, and that I don't really think that, it's like I almost don't think people should take it more than with a grain of salt, because you have to figure out how that advice works for you, because
Mm,
that is a very copy and paste form of advice. But when you can identify, like, okay, what's the real part of what they're saying? What's the real part of what they're saying? And how can I use that for me? How will it work or not work for me? Because then you get into the mode of people, thinking they have to create a TikTok every day or a reel on Instagram. And it's like, you don't. You really don't. Like, yes, the trends can come and go, and you might get algorithm, help from one thing and another. And it's like, dude, like, just do what you want to do, because at the end of the day, if you're authentically doing it and you are putting in the work, it can work at whatever realm that it's going to work within. It's not going to be
exactly.
overnight, it's not going to be $1 million instantly. It's not, it might take forever, it might, or it could never work. Who knows? There's no promise. But I think that sort of weird I don't know, sort of toxic creative culture that floats around. I think that's just very weird. And that it's like I dislike that just as much as like toxic positivity, like
Mm,
and that's a whole other topic that would take way too long for us to talk about. But
yeah.
it's like there's that, that's kind of become such a cliche of any positive saying is taken in such a way by so many people. And it's because they don't identify, like, well, what does it really mean? Like it's so
Mm,
it's become fabricated. It's become so glorified in weird ways, that it's like, well, yeah, but what does that actually mean though? Because it does mean something good, but you're pretending it means something bad because you're seeing it in so many weird cliche forms.
yeah.
Positivity and mindset and positive thinking does not mean pretend everything's fine. No, no, no.
There's a lot of
It actually it means to accept what's wrong, and feel those emotions and have those thoughts, have those feelings, be sad, be angry, whatever. But then understand at some point you have to take the next steps towards the healing process. You have to take the next steps
mm,
towards finding the solution. And I think a lot of people hear that
mm,
stuff, and again, they see the social media stuff and they're like, oh, I'll just make a bunch of TikToks and they're not going to matter at all. And I'm not putting my heart into it. I'm just going to make it so they get views, and they don't get results, and they're like angry or confused and think it doesn't work or whatever. And then at the same time, the positive thinking stuff that you see float around the internet, they're like, oh, well, you're just pretending things aren't bad. It's like, it's not that either. I think there's so many misconceptions that all sort of blend together, that all revolve around the entrepreneurial mindset and all that sort of stuff. But
Yeah. Nuance is lost on
mm.
the internet
yeah.
Well,
a lot of
and
time.
there's a lot of performative positivity, where people are like pretending to be a lot nicer than they are. Yeah,
Yeah.
personally, or just like as a business person.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Ross, it's been super cool having you on the podcast. Appreciate you showing up. If you're listening to this and you're like, I like what this Ross person has to say, I want to know more about it, has a whole podcast. All of the links to all of those things are in the show notes. I don't know where you could be listening to this that you're not able to immediately look at your phone or computer and access the show notes and click on them and go directly to wherever it is that Ross is available on the internet. I don't know. I can't conceive of a place to listen to this where you can't see the show notes unless you download the audio file separately.
But then I would have to send it to you.
Yeah.
And you didn't get it from me. You got it from...
People probably be putting our stuff, they torrenting the Gym Club podcast because it's sold out. There's no one in here. It's just us.
Gone.
So that's the line out the door.
We mentioned that earlier in the episode.
Yeah. Somebody's torrenting it for sure.
Definitely.
Because that's still a thing, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate it.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much. This has been an absolute blast.